What's up, everybody? Miss Lynch here. This is the first part of Chapter 19's lecture. Let's see, what's our title? Safe for Democracy, the United States and World War I, 1916 to 1920. Okay, so you should have everything in front of you and ready to go, and I am ready to go as well, okay? Alrighty, if you look at this image right here, of our cover photo, these are men running through what would be mustard gas, and I'll talk about the implementation of that here in just a second, but yeah, so we have some soldiers during the war, most likely in France, I'm guessing, but okay, let us talk about how this came about. Okay. War broke out in Europe in 1914 after a Serbian nationalist assassinated the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who was the heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Okay, he was assassinated in Bosnia, in Sarajevo, and this started what would be the First World War. Sets in motion this chain of events, but really it's important to note that, so Franz Ferdinand, okay, so our leaders of Austria-Hungary, Britain, and then Russia, they're all first cousins, okay? So this was really like a family feud that went awry and then literally turned into a global war, okay? So, whenever we talk about World War I, and I mean, we'll get to that here in a little bit, but the generation that comes out of World War I is very anti-war, anti-military, and it's because all of this seemed or was so completely unnecessary. Like I said, it was it was like a family squabble. Obviously, that's a mass generalization, but that is kind of why it's considered why it's so questionable that, you know, we would even get involved. It was this European war between these families that went back hundreds of years. And so, but anyway, we will unpack that. All right. Like I said, set in motion a chain of events that plunged Europe into the most devastating war the world had ever seen. And while the war is going on, it's called the Great War. That's what everyone referred to it as, okay? It wasn't World War I, because nobody knew that there was going to be a second Great War that would then constitute Wars I and II, you know? But anyway, so it was just called the Great War. And here I have listed for you, we have our allies, our ally powers. So this is Britain, France, Russia, and Japan to start, okay? So this is still 1914. And then our central powers, so Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, which is Turkey, and then other nations in the Middle East. Okay, like I said, we're still 1914, so early on, Germany quickly overran Belgium, okay, so, and France, northern France, I should say. So they overrun Belgium, part of France, and then there's kind of this stalemate, which will mark a big majority of the war, okay? A lot of trench warfare in France is what most people think of whenever they think of World War I. If anybody saw 1917, this is exactly what we're talking about. They're in the middle of France, trench warfare is happening, okay? But let us talk about some of the technology that's coming about during this time. Okay, submarines. First being tested during the Civil War era, but submarines become kind of widely used during this point in time. Airplanes also, which the way those are used throughout the war changes, as far as like mounting guns on, the airplane itself, and kind of those like dogfight scenarios. Okay, also weaponry, so machine guns come about, right? Tanks. So fortified transportation, all right, reinforced. And then poisonous gas. And so that's what the cover image for this chapter. That's why I chose this, because this is the first time mustard gas is being used. Like I said, so they're going through gas, this would be mustard gas. But so this is the Civil War at the time it occurred was considered the first modern war. All of these things, all of this technology that I'm talking about, this really truly makes World War I the first modern war. So I know that's debatable, but based on these technological advancements, that's what I'm going off of. Okay, so you heard it here first. Okay, but so mustard gas this is the first war that we see it being used, and then as a result of that, it leads to all of these other innovations. So this is the first time soldiers have to start shaving because they have to make sure that their masks fit close to their face because of mustard gas. So the Army starts issuing razors and watches so that they can coordinate actions. And anyway, so all of these technological advancements are happening. All right. Let's see. Okay. By the end of the war, 10 million soldiers and millions of uncounted civilians had died. And coming out of the war, there is then the Spanish influenza pandemic, which here we are in 2020. I'm sure you guys have heard people talking about the Spanish flu, Spanish influenza, all those comparisons. You've probably even seen commercials that are showing images from that point in time. But so that's what this is. Coming out of World War I, this pandemic happens. And as a result of that, and just, famine because of all of the destruction that happened during the war, but between multiple reasonings, but 21 million people died within, a year of the end of World War I, okay? Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about Spanish influenza. I know some people are researching stuff on it, so I will just kind of leave it at that for now. Okay. Alrighty, like I said just a second ago, looking at our allied powers and our central powers, I said for now, let's talk about what's going on with the U.S. Okay, Woodrow Wilson, President Wilson, proclaimed American neutrality at the beginning of the war, but American companies, so American commerce, and especially shipping, got wrapped up in the war in different aspects. And then there's the incident with the Lusitania, which was a British liner that was attacked by a German submarine. This killed 1,200 people, including 124 Americans, and that was when, then that was considered to be, this attack on Americans, and there's kind of this preparation for the U.S. to get involved, all right? Yeah, so by the end of 1915, President Wilson embarked on a policy of preparedness, like I was just saying, that expanded the Army and the Navy, just in case, Hold on one sec, sorry. Okay, so Wilson was in office from 1912 to 1916, is reelected on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." Okay, so this just shows that the American people don't want to go to war. They don't want to get involved in this. Highly pacifist sentiment kind of across the board right at this point, okay? Okay, going back to the Lusitania for a second. After that happened, Germany halted submarine warfare for a while, and then they resumed it, okay? So then there's this thing called, what is now known as the Zimmermann telegram, that is intercepted in 1917. And this was a message from the German Foreign Secretary Arthur Zimmermann calling on Mexican government officials to join the war against the United States So this is intercepted, and Wilson declares war, okay? So, I should back up. He asks Congress permission to make a declaration of war, all right? When he goes to Congress, he has what is called his 14 points. So these are his war aims. This is done in January of 1918. So like I said, he was going to Congress to ask permission. They give him the okay, and U.S. troops arrive in Europe beginning in the spring of 1918, arriving in Paris, okay? This leads to a counteroffensive in which the Germans are then being pushed back, all right? And the German Kaiser abdicated in November, so stepped down, resigned, in November of 1918, all right? So U.S. troops were really just there for, several months. Although, yeah, they're there for a short amount of time, but 100,000 Americans died during 1918 alone, just in regards to the war. Okay, so let me see. Okay. Bringing it back stateside. So while this is going on, and before this, I had made mention that women's suffrage and the discussion of women's voting rights gains momentum, okay? And the outbreak of war in the middle of that complicated situations, okay? Alrighty, so now I'm looking at the coming of woman suffrage. Weird way to put that, anyway, okay. So America's entry into the war threatened to tear the suffrage movement apart because many of those who were involved in the suffrage movement became involved in the anti-war movement. I can't find my place in the book right now. Okay, sorry. But yeah, so there's this division because a lot of people either support the war or they're against the war, okay? So that division is made. The terms democracy and freedom, oh no, my battery's low. Okay. The terms democracy and freedom as ideological war weapons. So that means that, which is kind of, it goes back to the idea of, as Americans, us going overseas and showing our ideologies of democracy and freedom and showing how we do things. But obviously this goes back to what we've been talking about. We know that women do not have the vote in the United States at that point in time. The nation is heavily segregated and still very much coming out of a lot of issues regarding the Civil War and Reconstruction and just systemic racism, still dealing with that. But so these ideas of saying, we know what democracy is about, we know what freedom means, and going overseas and fighting in wars and saying, like, don't worry, we're here to help, but then coming back and, like we're discussing now, this, who's free, who has 100% of these rights to a full democracy. Okay, so the idea of going overseas and using these terms, this inspires conversations at home. Okay, so think of tying that into women's voting rights specifically at this point in time, okay? Okay, most suffrage leaders during this time, so these women enlisted in the war effort. They sold things like war bonds. They organized rallies and so like collection drives, things like that. And then they also took war production jobs. So this is Rosie the Riveter a generation before, okay? And then also it's important to note that 22,000 women would go over to Europe during the war to work as clerks or nurses, most of whom would do so through organizations like the Red Cross to get funding, or, you know, if they were wealthy enough, they could pay for themselves to go do that. But yeah, it's important to note that, yeah, tens of thousands of women were volunteering to go over and serve as nurses and in administrative positions, okay? Alrighty, we've talked about them a little bit, but the National Women's Party, we talked about NASA. But so NASA's kind of like our old school suffragettes, and then the National Women's Party is our next gen that comes in, and they are, you know, radical and more militant than the older generation. And this is kind of led by Alice Paul. I might have mentioned it before, but HBO did a movie 16 years ago, and Hilary Swank plays Alice Paul. It is very good. Do recommend Iron Jawed Angels, and I think it's on the streaming platforms out there, okay? But so yeah, Alice Paul, this radical leader of the new suffragettes, she was a Quaker woman. They were considered scandalous for their new ways. And I had said before, I'd shown a picture of a woman in front of the White House gates being arrested and yelled at. That's this group of women, okay? So these are the radicals that went in front of the White House with banners quoting Wilson, using these terms of democracy and freedom to support their message. So if you watch Iron Jawed Angels, it goes into all of that. It shows their time in prison. But yeah, so dozens of women were imprisoned for the 7-month period. They went on hunger strikes, like I said before. They were force-fed with feeding tubes and raw eggs. That's how the protein that they would be force-fed. And whenever it came out, it came out in papers the way these women were being treated, and the public started really ridiculing President Wilson for allowing that to happen to this group, mostly young women. But so he was very heavily criticized for his inaction regarding women's voting rights. But so, after all of this, we finally have the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920, and that gave women the right to vote. There you go. Okay. Alrighty. So if you have the 6th edition with you, I am on page 584 now. And actually just looking at the previous page where it starts War at Home, there's this image for the war bonds, and then the US Navy recruiting station, and then on the next page there's a cartoon advocating for women's voting rights. But all of these, oh, and even on the next page. What is this? Okay. Anyway, but all of these have to do with the image of Lady Liberty, which that brings us back to, I'm trying to think of how to even, anyway, this just goes back to advertising, whatever chapter that was that we got into that. I think it was just our last chapter. But the rise of the consumer nation and Lady Liberty really being that icon for advertisers and activists alike, okay? Okay, so we are now looking at prohibition. That's what I was saying. I am on 584. All right, we're in the 1920s. This had happened in the 1890s also with Carrie Nation and the temperance movement, okay? So this is a bit of a resurgence. Alrighty, so prohibition. Employers hoped that this would create a better workforce because you wouldn't have hungover workers all the time. Reformists, pardon me, believed that this would promote more orderly cities, having less bars, you know, and people just out in the streets being publicly intoxicated. And women hoped that this would decrease domestic violence, which this is what goes back to the women's temperance movement and Carrie Nation and that conversation we had about it, okay? Alrighty. Going in line with the suffrage movement that is, you know, happening at the same point in time, prohibitionists came to see national legislation as being their best strategy rather than doing things at the local and state levels. All right, they knew that they needed to take it all the way up. And then World War I actually gave the prohibition argument more ammunition, mostly because the majority of breweries that were open, especially, you know, thinking of, you know, Wisconsin, North Central area, those breweries were all owned by German Americans, all right? During World War I, there's a lot of anti-German sentiment coming out against German immigrants. So the prohibition discussion just kind of uses that as a prime example of the ills of the German people. And yeah, so we're actually going back a step. So this takes us back to the 18th Amendment, which is what prohibits liquor sales, alrighty? This will last from 1920 to 1933 and is probably what becomes the most notable aspect of the 1920s, okay? Let me see. Where am I at? 22 minutes. Okay. I'm actually going to stop this consider this the halfway point, and then I will pick back up with the Espionage and Sedition Acts, because then that gets into discussion of who is American. Okay? Alrighty, so I'm going to call it quits for this one and pick back up with the second half. If you guys have any questions about anything, let me know. Okay. Toodaloo.